So as we continue playing catch up with DC Rebirth and all new, all different Marvel, what I want to do here is let you guys know ahead of time that starting next week, we're going to go ahead and transition to the schedule that I had mentioned, the one that you'll find down in the description. And we'll have one day dedicated to DC Rebirth and one day dedicated to all new, all different Marvel. And the reason for that is because for the most part, the bi-weekly series have largely been caught up on. And so all the first story arcs, most all the first story arcs are basically on the verge of being finished. There's a couple more, but in order to make sure that I don't run out of DC Rebirth content for like the next month or so, we're going to go ahead and start scaling things back because as you guys may have noticed and as you guys may have loved, we've been covering a lot of DC Rebirth and all new, all different Marvel stuff over the course of the last week. In fact, we've ran over pretty much all the first story arcs, which was my intention. But the idea here is I don't want to run out of content, so so make sure you guys check the description for that schedule so you guys know when things are going to be uploaded. So that way, if all you really want is DC Rebirth content, you know when to show up. If what you're looking for is all new, all different Marvel, you know when to show up. Comic book concepts, the Versus series, so on and so forth. And I'm actually going to try my hand at some Star Wars content, which we're gonna launch on Monday. I'm actually doing a project in collaboration with Star Wars Explained, which if you guys are Star Wars fans, you guys are very much aware of who that guy is. But the fact remains here, with Night of the Monster Men, I have to be honest with you guys with this one. I was a little unsure about it. When DC announced this solicitation, immediately the first thing that hit me was monster. And I personally never really found myself resonating very well with supernatural things. It's one of the reasons why I never really got into Constantine or Justice League Dark or Swamp Thing. And even on the Marvel side, it's one of the reasons why I never really got into the supernatural elements. I know about Mephisto, I know about the concept of hell, I know about those things, but I never really got into like Lucifer, things like that with DC, and I never really got into, you know, the supernatural stuff with Marvel Comics. But the great thing about Monster Men is that it's not supernatural. Monster Men is basically just biology. It's manipulating the human genome. And so what this story is basically the middle story. Now, for those of you guys who don't know, when it comes to story arcs, you know, when it comes to movies, TV shows, books, comic books, so on and so forth, the middle story is usually the one that sets things up for some great big huge event. It sets things up for the next thing. Now, whether or not we're actually going to see a conclusion with a trilogy is something I don't know, but this story very much gives off the impression that it's setting up for something big, but it also comes out of the last events of Detective Comics. And so again, this is the first Bat family-wide crossover between the Batman comics, Nightwing, and Detective Comics itself. And what we do here is we pick up with things that are actually pretty basic. They're pretty small. We basically just, we join Batwoman and Batman in the midst of a hurricane that set its sights on Gotham City. Now, because of the fact that they are the protectors of Gotham, their view here is that they simply need to just protect the city. They need to make sure that people who are in at-risk neighborhoods are going to be taken to safe locations so they don't have to worry about losing their lives in the midst of this hurricane. But the other thing they're doing too is they're also picking up with the fallout from the first Detective Comics story arc and the presumed death of Tim Drake. Now again, they don't know what's going on with Tim Drake. That's one of the things that we had pointed out, or that we would point out with regards to that Detective Comics story, is they don't know everything that's going on behind the scenes. And so to their eyes, Tim Drake is out of the picture. He's gone. For them, he's dead. And this affects Batman in a lot of different ways. While Tim Drake has been Red Robin for quite some time and has been operating out of Batman's direct shadow for quite some time, it doesn't mean that Batman hasn't forged connections. And that's one of the things that I really like about what Steve Orlando and Tom King are focusing on with this particular story, is it's really more about how Batman views the world than it is about anything else. Yes, there's the backdrop, yes, there's the Monster Men, but it's really about how the Bat family is coping with the presumed death of Tim Drake and what they do in response to this. Now, one of the interesting things here is that for Commissioner Jim Gordon, Batman is an ally. He sees Batman as an ally, but one of the things we also have to remember is that for the rest of the city and even for the police force, Batman's a vigilante, and for all intents and purposes, that's exactly what he is. Despite how we look at him, despite we see him as a superhero, he fights alongside the Justice League, he's helped save the world on a multitude of occasions, especially when we finish just talking about Justice League. Batman and the other members of the Bat family operate outside of the law's purview. Yes, the criminals are handed over to the police, yes, they're put on trial, they go to Arkham Asylum, but for the most part, Batman is still taking the law into his own hands in terms of how he apprehends those criminals. And that's one of the things that people tend to forget when it comes to Batman, is he's a superhero, it's okay for him to do what he does. Not everybody views things the same way as him, and this is something that I'd actually like you guys to keep in the back of your head, because as we progress through this story, we'll actually find out that Batman's going to reach out to Gotham City in a way that hasn't really been done before. Now, the other part of this is that if you'd seen my previous story arc, when we had talked about Gotham, when we had talked about Detective Comics, you know, when we had talked about basically bringing together these various members of the Bat family in order to create a more cohesive team team under the direction of Batman that Clayface was looking for redemption. This basically continues that journey. It continues the journey of Clayface, you know, of looking for a way to basically redeem himself of his past misdeeds. And so alongside Batman, he basically splits himself into a multitude of different forms, and he begins about the process of helping to lead innocent people to safety zones while disguising himself as police officers. Now again, this is why I like, you know, what Tom King and Steve Orlando are doing here, because it would have been very easy for them to just say, okay, Clayface is going to be cops and he's going to go off and rescue them, but they don't forget the small things. And one of the things that we know about Clayface is that water is his weakness, that if he's subdued with water, that it'll basically erode him, it'll turn him into a very malleable form. It'll take away his ability to shapeshift and create solid constructs out of his clay body. With this, Batman's basically given him a serum that will protect him against the water's effects for a time. The issue with this is that for both this serum and Clayface itself, it's temporary. Clayface does have limits to what he can do. He can only hold a multitude of different forms for a certain amount of time. The amount of time it takes for him to revert back to his normal form depends on the form that he takes. If he copies just a singular person, if he turns his entire body into Batman, so to speak, he would be able to do that for a lengthy amount of time. But if he splits himself into dozens of people, he won't be able to do that nearly as long. And so this is basically kind of, you know, Tom King and Steve Orlando telling us we're on a ticking clock here. You know, the timer's been set, and it's really just a matter of running down. The issue with this is that while they're in the midst of planning out a way to essentially rescue people from at-risk neighborhoods and get them out of the dangers of the hurricane, the city of Gotham is suddenly besieged upon by a giant monster, quite literally a giant grotesque monster. Now, of course, Batman and his team immediately begin the process of trying to figure out what to do next. And this is when the story gets cool, because the forces are basically split in half. You have Batman and you have Batwoman, who are tending to this monster, who are trying to deal with this monster. But you have Spoiler, you have Orphan, you basically have Batwoman's trainees dealing with helping individuals to get out of the eye of the hurricane. And so again, it's really kind of fighting on two fronts. But the other half of this is that because Batman believes that Tim Drake is dead, because he believes that Tim Drake died, his main focus here is to make sure that no one dies, to make sure that no one loses their lives in this conflict. Now, from here, once this monster is defeated, what Batman and his crew do is immediately try to figure out where it came from. And this is par for the course, you know. Whenever it is a Batman comes across a foe he doesn't recognize, one of the first things they do is analyze that individual, whether it's scanning their body or taking cells from their body and analyzing them, and they try to deduce who this person is or where this thing came from. And that's what happens here. Of course, Batman takes a sample, sends it back to the Batcave for analysis by Duke Thomas and by Alfred. And what they tell him is that these cells belong to a man by the name of Castro. Now, something I'd like you to keep in mind here is that this is not the first time that Robert Castro has appeared. If you saw my story arc on Batman I Am Gotham, we had talked about how there was just kind of a nonchalant thrown in there scene where a guy by the name of Robert Castro showed up in the office of Commissioner Gordon, said the monster men were coming, and then killed himself. Now again, this was really just kind of thrown away. This is something that I pointed out would be important to the Night of the Monster Men story, but it was something that was just kind of thrown in there. So if you didn't really know where it was leading to, or you saw it as something that was just kind of thrown in, it would have been easy to dismiss. Now this is one of the cool things about crossovers, especially about what's happening with DC Rebirth, is that everything's important. Things that get thrown in, especially the things that seem out of place, are always the most important because they become important later on down the line. Now again, because of the fact that it seems as though Robert Castro had killed himself, because Robert Castro had most likely been taken to the morgue in Gotham City, the idea now becomes they have to split their forces even further. And so what happens is Nightwing is essentially tasked, I guess Dick Grayson is tasked with traveling to the morgue in order to find out what happened to the body of Robert Castro once it arrived. The issue with this is that for Nightwing, it's a very daunting task because no one really knows what awaits him there. And we've historically seen, right, you know, in Batman comics, we've historically seen situations where someone goes to investigate the source of a situation and then all hell breaks loose. But what Tom King and what Steve Orlando are doing here is basically telling us hell's already broken loose. Things are already going insane. What's the worst that can happen by going to the source and finding out how all this stuff started in the first place? But what they're going to do is they're going to take this premise and they're going to turn it on its head, where we would expect to see some kind of explanation on where things came from, on how this started. They're actually going to reverse the entire situation, which is something that I loved about this story, about what they did. And so again, while they're in the midst of going about their planning, while they're in the midst of trying to figure out what the next step should be, they're besieged upon by yet another monster. And this is why I say, this is why I said that Batman will address Gotham City in a way that he hadn't really done before. For Bruce Wayne, it's important that he be the face of Gotham, that he reach out to Gotham as Bruce Wayne, that he have charitable acts, that he ensures that the city's taken care care of in terms of its financial issues, in terms of ensuring that education is given to neighborhoods that would otherwise not receive the best education possible. But as Batman, it's also important that Gotham City trust him. Now, with regards to Batman in this line of publications, one thing I want to do here is I want to draw on continuity for a second. So for those of you guys who are well versed in Batman's continuity with regards to the New 52 and DC Rebirth, bear with me for a second while I run over this for those who aren't. So for Batman as a character, he's so popular in DC. You know, ever since Dark Knight Returns, when it was written by Frank Miller, ever since that story came out, he's always been popular. It kind of fluctuated, you know, with regards to him versus Superman prior to the Dark Knight Returns, and Superman had kind of overtaken Batman in terms of popularity and always had been ever since his original introduction. But with the Dark Knight Returns, and because Superman was already faltering in popularity, it allowed Batman the opportunity to become even more popular. And so we got a multitude of really cool stories out of that. We got Batman Year One, we got The Killing Joke, we got Nightfall, you know, we got Hush, we got some really good storytelling. Because of the fact that these stories were so popular, when the New 52 came around in 2011, DC did not actually reboot Batman. Instead, what they said is it's only been 5 years since Bruce Wayne became Batman, and everything that's happened within that 5-year window. But the only things that happened were the things that DC told us about. And so it wasn't until DC did Batman Eternal that Hush actually became part of the New 52 continuity. It wasn't until, you know, we got Batman Year One, or until we saw Barbara Gordon's story in Batman as part of Scott Snyder's trilogy on the Joker, that The Killing Joke became part of Batman's continuity. We were just kind of left to assume that maybe all these different stories between Batman's first appearance up to the New 52, that maybe they happened, maybe they didn't. It actually didn't become official until DC said it became official. The problem with this was that we as readers were expected to believe that Nightfall and that The Killing Joke and that The Dark Knight Returns, that all these stories had all happened within a 5-year window, and it kind of stretched the limits of credulity. But what this does is this basically ties into the entire concept of the Night of the Monster Man by basically telling us that in the eyes of Batman, you know, he's never really stepped up and made sure that the people in Gotham City trusted him. He always operated behind the scenes. Yes, he captured criminals, but in the end, the people of Gotham didn't really know if he was a guy that could be trusted. But what happens here is Batman addresses this issue. He immediately sends out these little hologram devices around the city and starts telling people they know who he is. They know that he protects Gotham City. They can't necessarily trust him just because of the fact that he is so clandestine, he is so stealthy, but at the end of the day, he's there to keep them safe. And what he's done is set up a series of safe zones around Gotham City that all these people can travel to and remain safe from the hurricane and the monsters that are tearing everything to pieces. The other half of this coin is that Tom King and Steve Orlando basically draw on humans, basically draw on human nature. And what I mean here is that it's human nature to panic. It's human nature to want to preserve our own lives. And people will go to extreme lengths in order to do that. We see it all the time. You know, when you sit down and you watch post-apocalyptic movies, for example, you watch something like Mad Max, you see that people sacrifice their own moral compass for the purpose of ensuring their own safety. And that's usually what happens in a situation like that. You know, say for example, that the world were to go to pot, that the United States were to experience some massive revolution or something like that, the government came crashing down, and the entire United States was just kind of like the Wild West where there was no law and order, there was no government. You would just see people rising up. You would just see like strong men rising up, petty warlords rising up, and people flocking to those warlords and strongmen for a measure of protection. That's basically what Steve Orlando and Tom King draw on here. Not in the sense of warlords, but in the sense of panicky people. When all these individuals are taken and they're put into a cave for their own protection, the most logical situation happens. One, they begin to get angry. They begin to panic. They begin to ask the question, why are we here? We've been here for hours. The stress of the situation starts to get to them. But this is culminated by the fact that they begin to gain exposure to whatever this toxin, whatever this ooze is, that's causing people to turn into monster men. And the result is that it feeds on their anger and it feeds on their rage, and it begins the process of turning them into people who have just totally lost any semblance of self-control and allow the complete totality of their anger and rage to come to the surface, overriding everything else. And so again, while this isn't really, you know, Tom King and Steve Orlando hitting it on the nose and saying, here's everything that people are going to do, here's the dark side of humanity, what they are telling us is that people have an inherent panicky, dangerous mode. And the result is that once this comes to fruition, if a situation is activated that will send them into this kind of a frenzy, then this is exactly the kind of situation that we'll see. And so what we do here is we pick back up again with Dick Grayson with Nightwing, and I apologize for that little spiel about about human nature. I just felt like it was something I really wanted to put in here because I felt like it really struck with the tone of the story. But what we do is we pick up with Dick Grayson, you know, back at this morgue, at the Tolliver Memorial Morgue. And again, this seems to be where all these things originated from, or at the very least, it's where the body of Robert Castro was sent to when he killed himself in front of Commissioner Gordon. And when he gets there, what he finds are 4 operating tables, each of which have these weird little things on them, weird items that appear to be pieces of monsters. And so the idea here is that Robert Castro and the other 3 people had been transformed into these giant monsters. In addition to this, we also learned that they seem to have buried underground. And so what happens is Dick Grayson, of course, takes a sample of this larval sac and sends it off to Alfred. And Alfred realizes that it belongs to a man by the name of Oleg, but it also belongs to 3 other people. And so it seems as though these 4 people had been genetically altered or manipulated to the point where they basically became these giant grotesque monsters. And so again, we basically sort of switch back to Gotham Harbor. We get a few more things going on here. This is really just kind of, Tom King and Steve Orlando giving us a rundown on all these things that are taking place and all these crazy monster scenarios. And so as this part of the story starts to wrap up, we actually find that Gotham Girl is no longer content with being held captive in the Batcave, or I guess being confined to the Batcave, and ends up joining into the fray. Now, with regards to the character of Gotham Girl, we saw that in our Batman story, I Am Gotham, that she and her brother Gotham had basically traveled to some unknown part of the world and received powers. But when those powers were activated or when they were used, depending on what level of power they wanted to achieve, they would sacrifice certain amounts of their life. And so if they wanted to just be a normal person, if they wanted to live longer than normal people, they would take a very small amount of their life. But if what they wanted to do was become gods in terms of their power, then that would take a huge amount of their life. And so the result here is that she's using her powers, but at the bare minimum, in order to ensure that she's not running on her life force at an extremely fast amount of time. And so again, we get this sort of quick montage of things that are going through. Of course, the caves at the Alexander Olsen State Park, where all those people were being held captive or being held for their own safety. All this red goo seems to have spilled onto them, and so they've basically reached a state of total insanity. They're losing their minds, they're immersed in rage, they're attacking Spoiler, they're attacking Orphan. Now, Spoiler and Orphan are able to make their way out of there, and this is when Orphan begins to draw on how to combat this situation, because with the presumed death of Tim Drake, one of the big issues here is that he was the foremost authority in the Bat family when it came to genetics, biology, different things like that, when it came to the sciences. Bruce Wayne is very intelligent, but Bruce Wayne is more of a jack of all trades, whereas Tim Drake was kind of a specialist in his own field. And the result here is that they don't have his intelligence to fall back on in order to nip this problem in the bud. But what Stephanie Brown realizes is that this substance is very similar to the kind of chemicals that plants send out whenever they're communicating. And so all these people are basically operating as a hive mind of rage. And the idea is to expose them to enough heat that it basically burns out the chemicals that are being sent out by this red goo, preventing these people from communicating as one mind and basically releasing them from the control of whatever this substance happens to be. And so what happens is Stephanie Brown and the various police that are still not infected begin setting torches out throughout this cave in order to make sure that they can heat it up as high as possible while not killing the people inside. And so again, jumping back to Dick Grayson, because of the fact that his journey had taken him to Blackgate Prison, because of the fact that Gotham Girl had headed directly to Blackgate Prison, because the infection is running amok and those people are basically stuck, they're essentially stuck in a place where they're all going to be killed. And once they arrive, they fight off these various miniature monsters, but we don't really know where they're coming from. But after these monsters are defeated, they eventually trace it back to one of those 4 people who were experimented on, who in turn has turned into a giant monster and is actually giving birth to these small little monsters. And so while they're able to kill these little monsters off, Gotham Girl turns her sight to this giant monster that's giving birth to them all and wipes it out in its entirety. The issue with this is that in her rage, when she was freaking out, when she was losing her mind, when she was trying to combat the fear that she was experiencing, she ended up exposing both herself and Dick Grayson to this green substance, meaning the 2 of them begin manifesting into monsters themselves. And so what this does is this allows us to transition to a situation whereby Batman's faced with the possibility of losing both Dick Grayson and Gotham Girl at the same time. Now, the reason why this is a big deal is because when people are transformed into monsters, this is one of the things that I liked about Tom King and Steve Orlando's writing, is our initial idea would be, if Gotham Girl's transformed into a monster, this monster would have all the same powers as she does, meaning it would make quick work of the entire Bat family. But they actually stave this off. What they say is that when these people become monsters, they're more like infants. They don't have higher brain thinking. And so what this does is it negates that question. It basically says, Gotham Girl is a monster. Yes, she's very strong simply because of her base durability, but she doesn't have the higher thinking capable of making her someone that can basically use strategy in her combat against the Bat family. And so Bruce Wayne also has to deal with this in the sense that for him, this may be another instance whereby he loses someone like Tim Drake, where he loses yet another member of the Bat family. And Bruce Wayne does not want to accept that. More so than that, Bruce Wayne harkens harkens back to the conversation that he had with Tim Drake when he was trying to talk him down from making himself a target and allowing himself to be killed. Now again, the Bat family doesn't know about Tim Drake. They don't know that he's being held prisoner. They don't know that he's being held by presumably Mr. Ozymandias as part of the Watchmen universe. To their eyes and to their mind, he's been completely dead, and it makes for a great situation because Bruce Wayne's panicking. Bruce Wayne's freaking out here because despite his whole situation of being hardened and so on, at his core, he cares very much for the various members of the Bat family. He cares very much for his sidekicks, and he wants to make sure that their lives are preserved as best he can. Not only that, because he's the leader of the Bat family, because of the fact that they fight alongside him, they follow him into battle. And so if they follow him into a situation and they die, Bruce Wayne sees it as his fault. If they hadn't gone with him, if he hadn't inducted them into the family, they wouldn't have died in the first place. And so again, this creates for some very compelling inner monologue, some inner turmoil with Bruce Wayne, and it's one of the reasons why I love the Batman concept so much, especially the way it's being written here. But the fact remains that because of the fact that Gotham Girl is so strong, because she's so durable, Batman basically bonds himself with Clayface. Now again, this is so cool because with Clayface, he's been such a strong villain of Batman, right? You know, he's been such a formidable villain of Batman over the years in the sense that when Clayface shows up on the scene, he is a challenge for Bruce Wayne to go against, usually because of the fact that Clayface does not allow himself to go into a fight against Batman where the odds are not in Clayface's favor. Batman usually has to lead him to that location and then use those weaknesses against Clayface. But to see the two of them working together is so awesome because Clayface's durability, his strength, you know, the fact that he can harden his skin makes him formidable, makes him easy to go against Gotham Girl. Now, that doesn't make it easy for him to take her out, but it does make it easy for the two of them to hold their own. And so because of the fact that Gotham Girl is so capable, what happened is that in the background, in the Batcave, because this larval sac had been sent to Alfred and to Duke Thomas, because they'd been doing their job and analyzing the larval sac to see what it was made of, what they did is they effectively developed what seemed to be a cure. And so what they do is they, of course, expose this cure to Gotham Girl, and she begins to come down off of her insanity. In addition to this, Tom King and Steve Orlando start wrapping things up. Because of the extreme heat that was generated inside the cave by Spoiler and by Orphan, the effects of this substance begin to wear off. These various people begin to lose, I guess, their impact on what it is that's affecting them. But what it turns out is that this is not necessarily what's going on. Instead, it's actually a ruse. That this substance, that all these things have just kind of merged into one giant monster of sorts, and the monster itself begins the process of laying waste to the city of Gotham. And so for the most part, it's basically on the remainder of the Bat family to both cure Dick Grayson of his exposure to the monster illness, as well as try to save Gotham City as best they can. And so as we start to wrap up with this part of the story, what we end up doing is we basically join with Dick Grayson, we join with Batman as they're cured of their illness, but we also begin to see Batman realizing that all of this stems back to Hugo Strange, that all of this is basically rooted in his actions. Now, the reason for why this was done won't be covered until the end of the story, but what we're told by Hugo Strange is that he's created something called a suicide suit. And what the suicide suit does is it basically, it'll kill whoever's wearing it if that person is punched. And this is basically Hugo Strange using Batman's moral compass against him. Now, for Hugo Strange as a character, one of the reasons why I love him so much is he's very much a narcissist, right? You know, Hugo Strange believes the world revolves around him. He believes that everything exists according to his whim. Not only that, Hugo Strange sees himself as the only sane person in an insane city. He even sees Batman as being insane. Now, this raises some great philosophical questions on whether or not Batman is actually insane. You know, is Batman a crazy person? After all, it's a guy who witnessed his parents being murdered, and the only way for him to seek justice was to dress up as a bat and attack people. Now, again, this is a whole different discussion in and of itself, and it's a discussion I'd love to have sometime. But for right now, again, you know, we're kind of focusing on this Night of the Monster Men story. And so what happens here is that once Batman arrives at the lair of Hugo Strange, that Hugo Strange basically begins to use Batman's moral compass against him. He says that because Batman doesn't kill people, that Batman is not going to attack Hugo Strange because it'll result in Hugo Strange's death. Now, if I were Batman, you know, I would have punched him as hard as I could in the face. Like I would have killed Hugo Strange, no questions asked. But, you know, again, this is Batman's moral compass. And the idea of Batman is to ensure Hugo Strange lives so that Hugo Strange can be sent to Arkham Asylum, so that Hugo Strange can possibly receive treatment or at the very least just be kept off the street streets. Now, the goal here of Batman is to also make sure that Hugo Strange is captured in a way that does not allow him to inflict harm on anybody else. And so while Hugo Strange is taunting Bruce Wayne, while Hugo Strange is basically saying, there's nothing you can do to stop me here, that Hugo Strange himself is going to kill Batman and take Batman's place, what ends up happening here is that Clayface begins to immerse the building in clay. Now, to backtrack here for a second, I want to talk about this Hugo Strange Batman situation. As far as I'm aware, and those of you guys who are more versed in Batman history than I am, you can correct me down in the comment section, but as far as I'm aware, there's never really been a story where Hugo Strange has pursued the notion of replacing Batman. Usually Hugo Strange is the hidden hand. Hugo Strange is usually the one behind the scenes. He's pulling the strings, and if the plan goes to pot, he bails out and he starts another plan. But the idea of him here is to say that because he's the only sane person in Gotham, because everybody else is insane in Gotham City, that Gotham City needs a sane Batman. And so again, his goal is to basically kill Batman and then replace him with himself. And so again, what ends up happening is that because Clayface is immersing this section of the building in clay, it's basically reducing the amount of oxygen available to Hugo Strange to breathe. And so because of this, he begins to succumb to his own insanity, to his own chemical alterations to his brain in order to make himself so sane. He begins to basically pass out. And so while he does hallucinate Batman for a second, in the end, he's basically captured and he's taken prisoner by Batman and presumably sent to Arkham Asylum. Now again, what we find is that, within a couple days after this is all wrapped up, after these monsters are defeated, after Dick Grayson is returned to normal, the Justice League arrives, which is kind of convenient, It's kind of funny. I like that Tom King and Steve Orlando are involving the Justice League. I guess the question I would have is, where were they the entire time? I guess we're kind of left to believe they were handling their own situation, but it's also kind of cool that they include the Justice League in this because the League is there, but it also tells us that Batman has his own stories to deal with. He has his own events. Not only that, he had the whole Bat family to fight on his behalf. And so if he had the whole Bat family, would he really need the Justice League? Not only that, would this story have been anywhere near as entertaining as it was if we had the Justice League? So, it's just kind of its own question to ask. But in any event, what we learn here as this on this last page as things begin to wrap up is that Hugo Strange's formula was rooted largely in some substance that was acquired from Santa Prisca prison, from Bane, and that it was derived from the venom substance that Bane uses. And so what Tom King and what Steve Orlando are telling us is that whether it's the next story arc, the story arc after, or maybe just in the Batman stories itself, Bane will become a part of the events that are going on, which I'm very excited to see, because what they've done right now is they've changed things up so much. For example, the original Monster Men, or I guess Night of the Monster Men in DC Comics, was actually superheroes. It was supervillains with powers. It was not monsters. It was supervillains with powers. And so they're taking this concept and they're turning it on its head. And again, with the character of Bane, I'm very excited to see what they do with him. But that pretty much wraps up Night of the Monster Men. Of course, it only happened over the course of a single night, and it's basically kind of a last bit conversation between Batwoman and Bruce Wayne, where Batwoman says there'll always be monsters, and the goal of the Bat family is to keep those monsters at bay as best they can. But if you guys enjoyed this story, make sure you guys drop a like, and make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps, and leave a comment down below. Let me know what you thought about Night of the Monster Men, because I thought it was interesting. It was fun, it was a pretty enjoyable story. I wouldn't say it's the best thing to come out of the Batman line of stories in DC Rebirth so far, but again, we're only maybe 3 story arcs in if we take into account Batman, Nightwing, and Detective Comics. So, we haven't gotten that far into DC Rebirth, and there's plenty of room to grow here. So yeah, let me know what you guys think so far, and I will catch you guys later. Peace.